The diplomatic vessel Oberon glided through the star-speckled darkness, its polished hull reflecting the distant light of Caedon's binary stars. Inside the ship's grand ceremonial chamber, Princess Liara Tars stood motionless by the viewport, her tall, slender silhouette casting a long shadow across the polished floor. The blue skin of her face appeared almost violet in the artificial light, her expression a careful mask of diplomatic neutrality despite the storm of emotions within. After 30 years of brutal war between humanity and the Syrian Empire, a fragile peace had finally been negotiated. The cost had been immeasurable. Billions dead, dozens of worlds scarred beyond recognition, entire generations raised knowing only conflict. Now that tenuous peace would be sealed with a marriage, her marriage, to a human soldier. "Your Highness," a soft voice called from the doorway, "Captain Vale has arrived." Liara didn't turn immediately. She took a moment to compose herself, straightening her ceremonial armor with its royal insignias. The weight of her dynasty's expectations pressed down upon her shoulders. As fifth daughter of Emperor Vostarin, she had been selected for this diplomatic union precisely because she was expendable to the royal line while still carrying enough status to satisfy human dignity. "Send him in," she said, her voice betraying none of her apprehension. The doors slid open, and Captain Orion Vale entered. He moved with a quiet economy of motion that immediately caught her attention. Not the swagger of a warrior, nor the hesitance of a diplomat, but something else entirely, measured, deliberate, as though conserving energy for when it would truly be needed. He was tall for a human, though still a head shorter than her Syrian height. His skin was tanned, weathered by exposure to elements on worlds she'd never seen. A jagged scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, partially concealed by short-cropped dark hair. His eyes, a startling shade of gray, met hers without flinching, neither submissive nor challenging, simply present. "Princess Liara," he said, offering the traditional Syrian salute, a closed fist pressed to the opposite shoulder. His pronunciation was flawless, surprising her. "Captain Vale," she replied in the common trade language, "I trust your journey was acceptable?" "It was," he answered simply. Liara waited for him to elaborate, to engage in the expected pleasantries, but he remained silent. This wasn't the behavior she had anticipated. Human diplomats usually tried too hard to impress, speaking at length about nothing of consequence. Military personnel typically projected strength through aggressive posturing. This man did neither. "You understand the purpose of our arrangement?" she asked, circling him slowly. "You will be my consort in name only, a symbolic union to satisfy both governments." "I understand my role," he said, his eyes following her movement with quiet attentiveness. "I'm a soldier. I follow orders." Something in his tone made her pause. Not resignation or bitterness, just a simple statement of fact. She found herself curious despite her determination to remain detached. "And what orders have they given you regarding this union, Captain?" A subtle shift in his expression, so slight she almost missed it. "To protect the peace, to honor your customs, to represent humanity with dignity." He paused. "To serve as your husband for as long as the alliance requires." Liara nodded, satisfied with his apparent docility. Perhaps this arrangement would be simpler than she had feared. A decorative soldier who knew his place, merely a piece in the great political game. She didn't need to concern herself with his thoughts or feelings, only his compliance. "We will arrive at the Caedon colony in 14 standard hours," she informed him. "The ceremonial proceedings will commence immediately. I suggest you prepare yourself." He inclined his head in acknowledgement but said nothing more. As Liara turned to leave, she glanced back at him. He stood exactly where she had left him, his posture relaxed yet vigilant, those gray eyes taking in every detail of the chamber. Something about his stillness unsettled her, though she couldn't articulate why. Just a human soldier, she reminded herself. Useful for appearances, nothing more. How profoundly wrong she was. The Caedon colony stretched across the horizon, a sprawling metropolis where human and Syrian architecture collided in a visual representation of their uneasy coexistence. Angular Syrian spires rose alongside the more utilitarian human structures, neither style yielding to the other. The air itself seemed charged with tension as the diplomatic procession made its way from the landing pad to the central plaza. Liara walked 3 paces ahead of Orion, as befitted her royal status. She was acutely aware of the eyes upon them. Blue Syrian eyes filled with resentment, human eyes brimming with suspicion. This colony had seen some of the fiercest fighting during the war. The wounds were still fresh, the memories still raw. They hate this, Orion observed quietly, falling into step beside her as they approached the ceremonial grounds. It doesn't matter what they feel, Liara replied. Only what they do. My father's enforcers and your military police will ensure compliance. Compliance isn't peace, he said. The comment surprised her, both in its insight and its boldness. She glanced at him, reassessing. You presume to lecture me on governance, human? Just an observation. His eyes scanned the crowd, moving systematically across potential vantage points and access routes. Peace built on fear doesn't last. Then it's fortunate that we're building it on law and alliance instead, she countered, though something in his words resonated uncomfortably. The central plaza had been transformed for the occasion. A vast canopy of shimmering fabric stretched overhead, filtering the harsh sunlight into a more tolerable glow. Representatives from both governments lined the approach to the ceremonial platform, their expressions carefully neutral despite the historic nature of the event. High Priestess Televos, her blue skin lined with the ritualistic scars of her office, stepped forward as they approached. The stars have aligned for this union, she intoned, her amplified voice carrying across the plaza. Two bloodlines, two worlds, joined as one. Liara felt Orion tense beside her, so slightly that anyone else would have missed it. His eyes had narrowed, focusing on something in the crowd. What is it? She whispered. Third level, western quadrant, he murmured, his voice barely audible. Someone's moving against the crowd flow. Before she could respond, he was guiding her forward, his hand light but insistent at the small of her back. To observers, it would appear as a gesture of solidarity. To Liara, it was an unexpected presumption. She was about to reprimand him when she caught a flicker of movement exactly where he had indicated. The ceremony proceeded, ancient words spoken in both languages, promises of loyalty and cooperation exchanged. Throughout, Orion's attention remained divided, his responses automatic while his eyes continuously swept the gathering. Liara found her own concentration faltering, his tension infectious. When the moment came to exchange the ceremonial bands, Orion took her hand with surprising gentleness. His fingers were calloused, bearing the marks of someone who had wielded weapons far more often than diplomatic instruments. Yet his touch was precise, respectful. As he slipped the simple platinum band onto her finger, his eyes met hers for the first time since the ceremony began. In that moment, she saw something unexpected. Depth, intelligence, and a weariness that spoke of burdens carried too long. Then it was gone, his expression once again impassive as she completed the ritual. By the authority of both our peoples, the high priestess declared, I pronounce this union. The explosion came from the western side of the plaza, exactly where Orion had been watching. The deafening blast sent shockwaves through the crowd, followed immediately by screams and chaos. Liara's security detail moved to surround her, but Orion was faster. In a fluid motion, he pulled her down behind the ceremonial altar as projectiles whistled through the air where they had been standing. His body positioned itself between her and the direction of the attack, a human shield of flesh and bone. Stay down, he ordered, all pretense of deference gone. A second explosion rocked the eastern side of the plaza, a coordinated attack designed to create maximum confusion. Through the billowing smoke, Liara saw figures moving with military precision, a mix of humans and Syrians working together, targeting the diplomatic contingent. Separatists, she hissed, recognizing the tactics from intelligence briefings. Extremists from both sides who preferred war to any form of peace. Her guards were engaging the attackers, but the confusion was making it difficult to establish a defensive perimeter. One of the assailants broke through, charging toward their position with a vibroblade raised. Liara prepared to defend herself. She was no stranger to combat despite her royal status. But before she could move, Orion was on his feet. He intercepted the attacker with shocking speed, deflecting the blade with his forearm. The ceremonial armor he wore for the wedding absorbed the impact, and in the same motion, he delivered a precise strike to the attacker's throat. The assailant dropped without a sound. Orion immediately retrieved the fallen blade, testing its weight with a practiced flick of his wrist. 3 more attackers converged on their position. Liara rose to join the fight, drawing the ceremonial dagger from her belt. But what happened next left her momentarily stunned. Orion moved like water, fluid, unstoppable, finding the path of least resistance. The vibroblade became an extension of his arm as he engaged all three attackers simultaneously. There was no wasted movement, no flashy technique, just lethal efficiency. In seconds, all three lay motionless at his feet. "We need to move," he said, returning to her side. Blood, not his own, spattered his ceremonial whites. This wasn't random. They were targeting you specifically. Liara stared at him, seeing him truly for the first time. This was not the docile diplomat soldier she had dismissed. This was something else entirely. "Who are you?" she demanded. A humorless smile flickered across his face. "Your husband, apparently. Now move." The emergency shuttle bucked wildly as it cut through Kaidan's turbulent upper atmosphere, the pilots struggling to maintain control as they fled the chaos of the colony. Liara braced herself against the bulkhead, watching as Orion conversed quietly with the human security officer who had facilitated their escape. The past hours had been a blur of violence and revelation. 17 dead at the ceremony, including 3 high-ranking diplomats. Both governments were already pointing fingers, the fragile peace threatening to crumble before it had truly begun. "The official channel is compromised," Orion said, returning to where she sat. He had discarded his bloodied ceremonial garments for a simple utility uniform. "Someone leaked our escape route." "Impossible," Liara countered. "Only my most trusted advisors knew the contingency plans." "Then one of them isn't as trustworthy as you believed." His matter-of-fact tone carried no accusation, just cold assessment. "The shuttle's being tracked. We can't risk leading them to any secure facility." Liara felt a chill settle in her stomach. "What are you suggesting?" "We go to ground," he said. "Disappear until we can determine who's behind this and communicate with loyal elements in both governments." The shuttle lurched again, more violently. This time, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Proximity alert! We've got pursuit craft closing fast." Orion moved to the view screen, assessing their situation with a single glance. "Set course for the Kaidan Badlands. We'll use the canyons for cover." "The Badlands," Liara objected. "That's uninhabitable territory, acid storms, predatory wildlife, and no population centers or surveillance systems," Orion finished for her. "Perfect for disappearing." The pilot hesitated, looking to Liara for confirmation. She was unaccustomed to having her authority questioned, especially by a human who was, technically, her subordinate by both marriage custom and diplomatic protocol. But something had shifted between them in that plaza. The carefully constructed hierarchy had been shattered by violence and necessity. "Do as he says," she finally ordered, her eyes locked with Orion's. The shuttle banked sharply, descending toward the rugged landscape below. Red warning lights flooded the cabin as their pursuers launched the first salvo of weapons fire. "They're not trying to capture us," Orion observed, his voice unnervingly calm. "They want us dead." The shuttle shuddered as a glancing hit struck their port stabilizer. Smoke began to fill the cabin as systems failed one after another. "Brace for impact," the pilot shouted as the craft plummeted toward the jagged canyon floor below. Liara felt strong hands pulling her into crash position, securing her harness with practiced efficiency. Orion's face was inches from hers, his expression focused and unafraid. "When we hit, move fast," he instructed. "Head for the eastern ridge. Don't wait for me." "I don't take orders from you, human," she replied automatically, though without real conviction. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Consider it a suggestion between spouses, then." The impact, when it came, was devastating. Metal screamed against stone as the shuttle carved a furrow into the canyon floor, shedding pieces of its hull like a wounded animal losing scales. Liara's world became noise and pain and darkness. When consciousness returned, she found herself being dragged from the smoking wreckage. Orion's face swam into focus above her, a gash across his forehead, painting half his features in crimson. "Can you stand?" he asked, his voice seeming to come from very far away. She nodded, though she wasn't entirely certain. As her senses returned, Liara became aware of their dire situation. The shuttle was a ruined husk, the pilot's body still visible in the shattered cockpit. The distant whine of pursuit craft echoed through the canyon. "They'll be here soon," Orion said, already gathering supplies from the wreckage. A survival pack, emergency rations, a canteen. "We need to move now." Liara forced herself to her feet, ignoring the protests of her bruised body. Syrians were naturally more durable than humans. Their denser muscle tissue and reinforced skeletal structure, an evolutionary adaptation too, their homeworld's higher gravity. Yet Orion showed no signs of being hindered by his injuries, moving with the same controlled precision she had witnessed during the attack. "You're bleeding," she noted, indicating the wound on his head. He touched it absently, seeming genuinely surprised to find blood on his fingers. "It's nothing. Surface wound." He tore a strip of fabric from his sleeve, binding it around his head with practiced ease. "The eastern ridge will provide cover and a vantage point. We can assess our options from there." As they began their ascent up the steep canyon wall, Liara found herself studying her unexpected companion with new eyes. The diplomatic facade had been completely stripped away, revealing someone altogether different underneath. Someone dangerous, competent, and utterly composed in crisis. "You were never just a symbolic consort, were you?" she asked as they paused on a narrow ledge, the ruined shuttle now small below them. Orion was scanning the horizon, his eyes narrowed against the harsh glare of Kaidon's sun. "Everyone serves a purpose," he replied enigmatically. "Mine was to ensure the Alliance survived, one way or another." "Your special operations," she guessed, the pieces falling into place. "Human military intelligence." He neither confirmed nor denied, simply continued his survey of their surroundings. "We're exposed here. Those pursuit craft will have ground teams deployed within the hour. We need shelter before nightfall." "Before the acid rain," Liara agreed, familiar with Kaidon's deadly meteorological cycles. The planet's unusual atmospheric composition resulted in highly corrosive precipitation that could melt exposed flesh in minutes. As if on cue, the distant horizon darkened with ominous clouds, their underbellies glowing with an unnatural purple luminescence. The approaching storm would reach them by dusk. "This way," Orion decided, pointing toward a deep fissure in the canyon wall. "That might lead to caves we can use for shelter." The next hours were a grueling test of endurance as they navigated the treacherous terrain. The jagged rocks cut through their clothing, and the rising temperature as the day progressed sapped their strength. Yet Orion maintained a steady pace, occasionally offering a hand when the climbing became particularly precarious. Liara found herself grudgingly impressed. Humans were generally considered the weaker species physically, their evolution on a lower gravity world resulting in less density and durability. But Orion moved with a sure-footed confidence that belied this stereotype, conserving energy and choosing his path with tactical precision. The fissure eventually opened into a network of caves, providing the shelter they desperately needed as the first drops of acid rain began to fall, sizzling against the rocks outside. Orion immediately set about establishing a defensible position, arranging their meager supplies and scouting the deeper recesses of the cave system. "We should be safe here until the storm passes," he said upon returning. "There's a fresh water spring about 50 meters in. No signs of recent occupation, animal or sentient." Liara sank down against the cave wall, the events of the day finally catching up with her. Her ceremonial armor, designed for appearance rather than function, had provided little protection during their escape and climb. Beneath the ornate blue metal plates, her skin was bruised and lacerated. Orion noticed her discomfort immediately. Without asking permission, he knelt beside her and began examining her injuries with clinical detachment. "Superficial," he pronounced after a thorough assessment, "though there's risk of infection if we don't clean these cuts." He reached for the canteen. "May I?" The request for permission, coming after he had already conducted his examination, struck Liara as oddly contradictory. Yet she found herself nodding, watching as he carefully cleaned her wounds with their limited water supply. "You've had medical training," she observed. "Everyone in my unit did." Again, that careful non-answer. "Field medicine is essential when extraction isn't an option." "And what unit was that exactly?" she pressed. His hands paused momentarily before continuing their work. "Does it matter? We're both soldiers caught in something bigger than ourselves." "I am the fifth daughter of Emperor Vostarin," she reminded him sharply. "I am not just a soldier." "Out here you are," he replied, meeting her gaze directly. "Royal blood won't stop acid rain or separatist bullets. Out here, you're just a Syrian trying to stay alive. Same as I'm just a human doing the same." The blunt assessment should have offended her, yet Liara found herself unable to dispute his logic. In the wilderness of Kaidon, far from the trappings of power and protocol, the distinctions that had defined her existence seemed suddenly arbitrary. Outside, the acid rain intensified, creating a deadly curtain that sealed them inside their rocky shelter. The distant boom of thunder echoed through the canyon, accompanied by flashes of lightning that momentarily illuminated the cave entrance. "We should rest while we can," Orion suggested, sitting back on his heels. "Tomorrow we'll need to assess our situation, try to establish communication if possible." "And if we can't?" Liara asked. "Then we survive until we can," he answered simply. "That's what humans do best, according to your people's intelligence reports. We survive." The casual reference to Syrian military intelligence was deliberate, Liara realized, a reminder that he was more informed than she had assumed. This man had been briefed, prepared, chosen specifically for this mission. While she had dismissed him as a political pawn, he had been assessing her all along. "Why you?" she asked suddenly. Out of all the human officers they could have selected for this arrangement, why send someone with your obvious capabilities? It made more sense to choose a diplomat, someone versed in Syrian culture. Orion was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the dim light of their emergency lamp. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, touched with something like resignation. "Because they expected this to fail," he said. "Both sides did. The public ceremony, the symbolic union. It was theater, a performance to satisfy those who wanted peace. But the power structures on both sides have been shaped by 3 decades of war. Too many people profit from conflict to allow peace to take root so easily." "You're saying we were set up to fail from the beginning?" The possibility sent a cold wave of anger through Liara's chest. "I'm saying we were insurance," he corrected. "If the peace held, I was a symbolic consort as planned. If it failed," he gestured to their current circumstances, "then I was the contingency plan to keep you alive long enough to salvage whatever could be saved." The implications were staggering. If he was correct, then elements within both governments had anticipated, perhaps even welcomed, the attack at the ceremony. The peace treaty itself might have been nothing more than an elaborate deception. "I don't believe you," she said, though her conviction wavered. "My father would not sacrifice his own daughter." "Not sacrifice," Orion amended. "Utilize. There's a difference. He placed you with the one human he believed could keep you alive if everything went wrong." "And how would he know that?" she challenged. Orion's expression shifted subtly, a complexity of emotion briefly visible before being carefully concealed once more. "Because he and I have met before, Princess. On the battlefield at Cygnus Prime." Liara froze, the name of that infamous battle sending a shock through her system. Cygnus Prime had been the turning point of the war, a devastating confrontation that had resulted in thousands of casualties on both sides. "Including my brother," she whispered. "Talon was killed at Cygnus Prime." "He wasn't killed," Orion corrected quietly. "He was captured by my unit." The revelation hit Liara like a physical blow. "That's impossible. The official report stated—" "The official report was diplomatic fiction," Orion interrupted. "Agreed upon by both sides to save face. The truth is that Prince Talon was captured alive, treated for his injuries, and returned to Syrian custody through unofficial channels 3 months later." "Returned by you," Liara realized, the pieces clicking into terrible place. "That's why my father chose you. You spared my brother when you could have killed him." Orion's silence was confirmation enough. Outside, the storm raged on, acid rain etching patterns into the stone as lightning split the darkening sky. Inside, a different kind of storm was brewing as Liara confronted a reality that upended everything she had believed about the war, her family, and the human who was now, by law and ceremony, her husband. Why didn't Talon tell me?" she demanded. "Part of the arrangement," Orion explained. "Complete confidentiality. The war was at a critical juncture. Neither side could afford to appear weak. A secret prisoner exchange preserved the necessary illusions while opening a channel for eventual peace negotiations." Liara turned away, needing space to process this revelation. Her brother, her closest sibling, the one who had taught her to fight, to lead, had kept this from her. Had known who Orion was all along and said nothing. "Get some rest," Orion suggested, his voice betraying no emotion. "I'll take first watch." Without waiting for her response, he moved to the cave entrance, positioning himself where he could observe both the storm outside and the deeper recesses of their shelter. His profile was silhouetted against the intermittent flashes of lightning, shoulders set with the quiet vigilance that she was beginning to recognize as his natural state. Liara settled against the opposite wall, physically exhausted yet mentally racing. Everything she thought she knew about her diplomatic mission, about her role, about the human she had been sent to bind herself to, had been built on partial truths and calculated omissions. What else didn't she know? And more importantly, what would happen when the storm cleared and they were forced to venture back into a world where both sides might now consider them expendable? As sleep finally claimed her, one thought remained. The human she had dismissed as harmless had just become her only ally in a game where all other players appeared to be enemies. Dawn broke over the Kaidan Badlands, the acid rain having given way to a strange, oppressive stillness. The air hung heavy with mineral particulates, casting everything in a hazy blue light that distorted distance and perspective. Outside their cave shelter, the landscape had been transformed. Rock formations partially dissolved by the corrosive precipitation, creating surreal sculptures of pitted stone. Liara awoke to find Orion already active, methodically converting parts of their emergency supplies into more practical equipment. He had fashioned a crude filtration system for the water, removing the caustic elements that had been carried down by the rain. From the wreckage of his ceremonial armor, he had crafted a long, narrow blade, a simple but effective weapon. "You should have woken me for my watch," she said, rising stiffly from the hard cave floor. "You needed the rest more than I needed sleep," he replied, not looking up from his work. Syrian physiology requires deeper recovery cycles after stress. The casual display of knowledge about her species' biology was another reminder that this man was far more than he had initially appeared. How much did he know about her personally? How long had he been preparing for this mission? "We need to move," he continued. "The storm will have grounded pursuit temporarily, but they'll be airborne again soon. We should use this window to put distance between us and the crash site." "And go where?" Liara challenged. "The nearest settlement is the colony we just fled, and beyond that, there's nothing but wilderness for 1,000 kilometers in any direction." Orion finally looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers directly. "There's an old mining outpost about 80 kilometers east, abandoned during the early phase of the war. It might have communication equipment we can salvage." "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I fought here," he said simply. 7 years ago, the 4th Expeditionary Force pushed Syrian troops back from the eastern plateaus. We used that outpost as a forward operating base before your people's counteroffensive. The casual reference to their shared history of violence should have reignited her anger, but Liara found herself responding to the pragmatism behind his words instead. They were both products of the war, shaped by its necessities and horrors. Denying that reality would serve neither of them now. 80 kilometers through this terrain will take days, she noted. 3 if we maintain good pace, he agreed. The acid levels in the soil will be elevated after the storm. We'll need to fabricate protective coverings for our boots. Without further discussion, they set about preparing for the journey. Liara found herself following Orion's lead almost unconsciously. His expertise in wilderness survival was evident in every decision, from the way he rationed their supplies to the route he charted through the treacherous landscape. As they ventured out into the transformed Badlands, Liara was struck by the alien beauty of Kaidan's wilderness. The planet had been settled jointly by humans and Syrians nearly a century ago, before diplomatic relations had soured into war. Neither species was native to this world, yet both had claimed it, fought for it, died for it. The terrain grew increasingly challenging as the day progressed. What had appeared to be solid ground often concealed pockets of caustic mud that could burn through their improvised footwear. Indigenous wildlife, adapted to the harsh environment, watched their passage with predatory interest. 6-legged creatures with blue-tinged fur that blended perfectly with the mineral-rich soil. Hexapods, Orion identified them. Territorial but not usually aggressive unless threatened. They hunt in packs during the dusk hours. "You've encountered them before?" Liara asked, watching the creatures pace alongside their path, maintaining a cautious distance. "We lost 3 men to a pack near the southern ravine," he confirmed. "They're intelligent, coordinated. They herd their prey toward geographic traps before closing in." "Like soldiers," Liara observed. Orion's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. Nature developed effective tactics long before sentient beings thought to formalize them into military strategy. They pressed on, the twin sons of Kaidan beating down, mercilessly as they climbed a series of increasingly steep ridges. Liara's superior physical strength gave her an advantage on the ascents, while Orion's lighter human frame allowed him to navigate the looser scree with greater agility. They developed an unspoken rhythm, each compensating for the other's limitations. By midday, they had covered nearly 20 kilometers, though the difficult terrain had taken its toll. Their water supply was diminishing faster than anticipated, and the caustic soil had begun to degrade their protective coverings despite Orion's careful craftsmanship. "We need to find shelter," he announced, studying the darkening sky to the west. "Another storm system is moving in." Liara followed his gaze, noting the distinctive purple-black clouds gathering on the horizon. "That's not an acid storm," she said, her voice tightening with concern. "It's a dust cyclone, far more dangerous in this terrain." Dust cyclones were notorious on Kaidan, massive electromagnetic storms that lifted the mineral-rich soil into swirling vortices that could strip flesh from bone in seconds. Unlike the predictable acid rain, they changed direction erratically, making them nearly impossible to outrun once detected. "How long?" Orion asked, immediately shifting to tactical assessment. 2 hours, perhaps less, Liara estimated. "We need proper shelter, not just an overhang or cave entrance. The particulates will penetrate any exposed opening." Orion scanned their surroundings with newfound urgency. "There," he decided, pointing to a formation in the distance. "That looks like an old defense bunker, partially buried in the hillside." Liara squinted against the harsh sunlight. "That's at least 5 kilometers off our planned route." "Better to lose time than lose our skin," he replied grimly. "Come on." They altered course immediately, pushing their pace despite the risk of exhaustion. The hexapods that had been shadowing them seemed to sense the approaching danger as well, their pack-breaking formation to seek their own shelter among the rocks. The bunker, when they reached it, proved to be exactly what Orion had surmised, a remnant of the early conflict, half buried by landslides and weathered by years of exposure to Kaidan's harsh elements. The reinforced door had long since been torn from its hinges, but the interior structure appeared intact. "Check for structural weaknesses," Orion directed as they entered the dimly lit space. "I'll see if there is anything useful left behind." The bunker had clearly been abandoned in haste. Scattered equipment and personal belongings lay where they had been dropped, covered in years of fine dust. Liara moved cautiously through the main chamber, assessing the ceiling and walls for any cracks that might allow the deadly cyclone to penetrate. "The inner chamber appears secure," she reported, returning to find Orion sorting through a cache of abandoned supplies. "The outer door is compromised, but if we seal ourselves in the command center, we should be protected." Orion nodded, holding up his discoveries: a portable filtration unit, still functional, and several sealed ration packs that had somehow survived the years of abandonment. Most valuable of all was a compact medical kit, its contents largely intact. "Syrian military issue," he noted, handing it to her. "Your people built this bunker." Liara examined the kit, recognizing the imperial insignia on its casing. "Early war period, judging by the design. My people held this region initially, before the human counteroffensive." "The 4th Expeditionary Force," Orion confirmed. "My first deployment to Kaidan." A strange moment of connection passed between them. Enemies who had once fought for control of the very ground they now stood upon, now forced to rely on each other for survival. The approaching storm announced itself with a low, ominous howl as the wind began to pick up speed. Fine dust seeped through the damaged entrance, swirling in increasingly aggressive patterns across the bunker floor. "Time to seal ourselves in," Orion decided, gathering their supplies. "That sound will get much worse before it gets better." The inner command center was windowless by design, its heavy blast door still operational despite years of neglect. As they secured themselves inside, the howling intensified, rising to a screaming pitch that penetrated even the reinforced walls of their shelter. The very air seemed to vibrate with malevolent energy. Liara activated the emergency lighting system, surprised to find that the bunker's backup power cells still held a minimal charge. The pale blue illumination cast Orion's features in sharp relief as he methodically organized their supplies in the confined space. "How long will the storm last?" he asked, his voice raised slightly to be heard over the cyclone's roar. "Hours, possibly a full day," she answered. "They're unpredictable. All we can do is wait." Orion accepted this information with the same stoic pragmatism he had demonstrated since their escape. He set about creating a more comfortable space within the command center, arranging their limited bedding materials and establishing a small heating element using components from the abandoned equipment. The efficiency of his movements, the careful conservation of energy and resources. These were not the traits of an ordinary soldier. Liara had commanded troops during the war. She recognized the difference between basic training and specialized expertise. "You never told me your actual role in the human military," she said, watching as he worked. "Clearly not a standard infantry captain." Orion continued his task without interruption. "Does it matter?" "It might, given our current partnership of necessity." He glanced up at her, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "Special Reconnaissance Division. We operated behind enemy lines, gathered intelligence, facilitated high-value target extraction when necessary. Spies and assassins," Liara translated flatly. "Intelligence specialists and strategic asset managers," he corrected, though without particular heat. "The same as your Imperial Shadow Corps." The reference to the Syrians' most secretive military branch was deliberate, another reminder that his knowledge extended far beyond what a typical human soldier should possess. "If you were Special Reconnaissance, then the story about Cygnus Prime and my brother is exactly as I told you," he finished. "My team was tasked with locating and extracting high-value Syrian officers for intelligence purposes. Prince Talon was one such target. Yet you returned him instead of exploiting him for information." Orion's hands stilled momentarily. "The situation was complicated. By that point in the war, certain elements on both sides were beginning to recognize the futility of continued conflict. Your brother's capture presented an opportunity for unofficial communication channels. You're saying you were part of a peace initiative while still actively fighting?" "War and diplomacy have always existed in parallel," he replied. "The same hands that hold weapons also eventually sign treaties." Outside, the cyclone reached a new level of intensity, the screaming wind now punctuated by the impact of larger debris against the bunker's exterior. Inside, the air grew thick with tension as Liara processed the implications of Orion's revelations. "If what you're saying is true," she said slowly, "then you've been working toward peace for years. Yet you never mentioned this during our diplomatic preparations. Why maintain the pretense of being merely a symbolic consort?" Orion finished his work with the heating element before answering. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, forcing Liara to lean closer despite herself. "Because the same elements that wanted peace then are not necessarily the ones in power now," he explained. "Political landscapes shift, alliances form and dissolve. The fact that your father remembered my role in returning Prince Talon doesn't mean that everyone in your imperial court or my chain of command supports the same agenda. You think there are factions actively working against the peace process?" The possibility had occurred to Liara before, but hearing it articulated so directly was still unsettling. "I know there are," Orion stated with absolute certainty. "The attack at our ceremony wasn't random extremism. It was a coordinated operation with inside information from both human and Syrian sources. Someone very powerful wants this alliance to fail, Princess. Someone with access to military resources and diplomatic schedules." The implication hung in the air between them, too dangerous to voice explicitly. If he was right, then they could trust no one. Not her father's Imperial Guard, not his human commanders, perhaps not even the very governments they had sworn to serve. "So what do we do?" she asked the question, emerging more vulnerably than she had intended. For the first time since their ordeal began, Orion's expression softened slightly. "First we survive. Then we find a secure communication channel to reach those we can trust. Then," he shrugged, "then we decide whether saving this alliance is worth the cost. And if it isn't," his eyes met hers directly, "then we find a new way forward. Humans are adaptable that way. I suspect Syrians can be too when necessary." Something in his tone, a hint of genuine respect, perhaps even admiration, caught Liara off guard. Throughout her diplomatic training, she had been taught to view humans as clever but ultimately inferior beings, their shorter lifespans and less durable physiology marking them as a transitional species rather than equals to the Syrian Empire. Yet in the past 24 hours, this particular human had demonstrated resourcefulness, resilience, and strategic thinking that rivaled any Syrian commander she had served with. More than that, he had revealed a complexity of motivation and ethical consideration that contradicted the simplistic propaganda about human brutality that had fueled 3 decades of war. Why did you agree to this marriage arrangement? She found herself asking. If you suspected it might be compromised from the beginning, why accept the mission? The howling storm outside filled the silence as Orion considered his answer. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, carefully chosen. Because despite everything, all the bloodshed, all the betrayal, all the political manipulation, I still believe peace is possible, he said. Not the artificial peace of treaties and ceremonies, but real understanding between our species. I've seen enough death, Princess. I've caused enough of it myself. If there was even a slight chance that this union could prevent more suffering, I had to try. The raw honesty in his voice resonated with something deep within Liara's own experience. She too had seen the devastating consequences of the war, had lost comrades and family members to its insatiable appetite for destruction. The diplomatic platitudes she had been trained to recite seemed hollow in comparison to this simple, genuine expression of hope. Then we are more alike than I presumed, she admitted quietly. A ghost of a smile touched Orion's lips. Perhaps that's why they chose us, despite the risks. Perhaps someone realized that we might actually mean the vows we exchanged, even if the ceremony itself was political theater. The storm continued to rage outside their shelter, the cyclone's fury undiminished as day faded into night. Within the confines of the command center, something shifted between the unlikely companions. Not quite trust, not yet, but a mutual recognition of shared purpose that transcended their different worlds. You should rest, Orion suggested, gesturing to the makeshift bedding he had arranged. I'll monitor the storm's progress. We'll take shifts, Liara countered, unwilling to cede all responsibility to him despite his proven competence. 4 hours each. I'll take first watch. He nodded, accepting her assertion of equality without argument. As he settled onto the rudimentary bedding, Liara noticed for the first time the network of scars visible at his collar and wrists. Old wounds that spoke of battles survived, pain endured. This human, this supposed symbolic consort, had lived a life of violence and sacrifice parallel to her own. Orion, she said, his given name feeling strange on her tongue after days of formal address. When you faced my brother at Cygnus Prime, why did you choose to spare him? The truth, not the diplomatic version. He was silent for so long that she thought he might have already drifted into sleep. When he answered, his voice carried the weight of memory. Because he looked at me and saw a person, Orion said simply, not an enemy, not a target, a thinking being making choices, same as him. In that moment, killing him would have meant denying that recognition. I couldn't do it. The answer was so unexpected, so fundamentally different from the calculated political maneuvering she had assumed, that Liara found herself momentarily speechless. Before she could formulate a response, Orion's breathing had deepened into the rhythmic pattern of sleep, a soldier's skill, to rest when opportunity presented itself regardless of circumstances. Outside, the storm howled its fury against their shelter, while inside, Liara watched over her unexpected ally, pondering the strange paths that had brought them to this moment of fragile connection amid a galaxy torn by conflict. The mining outpost rose from the barren landscape like the skeleton of some massive creature, its metal framework corroded by years of exposure to Kaidon's caustic environment. After 3 grueling days of travel across the Badlands, the sight of their destination, even in its dilapidated state, brought a palpable sense of relief. There's no active power signature, Liara noted, observing the facility through a pair of makeshift binoculars Orion had crafted from salvaged bunker equipment. No signs of recent occupation either. Good, Orion replied, his voice hoarse from the mineral dust that had permeated everything during their journey. Means no one's had the same idea we did. The dust cyclone had eventually subsided, leaving behind a transformed landscape that had slowed their progress considerably. New chasms had opened where solid ground had once been, forcing lengthy detours. The hexapods had returned as well, their pack growing bolder as hunger overcame caution. Twice during their trek, Orion and Liara had been forced to stand their ground against the predators, fighting back-to-back with their improvised weapons. Those moments of coordinated defense had cemented something between them, a wordless understanding that transcended their official relationship. They moved now as a unit, communicating with gestures and glances where once they would have needed explicit instructions. We should approach from the eastern side, Orion suggested, studying the outpost layout. Less exposure, Better defensive position if we need to withdraw quickly. Liara nodded in agreement. Her ceremonial armor had been gradually discarded over their journey, its ornamental plates too cumbersome and conspicuous for their needs. She wore now only the flexible bodysuit underneath, its blue-black material designed to regulate temperature and resist environmental damage. Beside her, Orion had similarly adapted, converting parts of his uniform into more practical configurations, including a harness for the blade he had crafted. They approached the outpost cautiously, alert for any signs of surveillance or traps. The main entrance had been sealed, but a maintenance access on the lower level yielded to their combined strength, the metal groaning in protest as they forced it open. Inside, the outpost was a tomb of abandoned technology and forgotten purpose. Emergency lighting activated automatically as they entered, drawing power from backup systems that had lain dormant for years. The pale illumination revealed processing equipment, living quarters, and administrative offices, all left as they had been when the facility was evacuated during the early days of the war. "The communications center will be on the upper level," Orion said, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. "Standard design for these facilities." Liara followed him through the maze of corridors, noting the signs of hasty departure, personal effects still in lockers, half-consumed meals fossilized on tables, status reports frozen on screens that had long since powered down. Lives interrupted by the same conflict that had eventually brought her and Orion together. The communications center, when they reached it, was a disappointment. The main array had been deliberately disabled, key components removed or destroyed to prevent enemy use during the evacuation. "Thorough job," Orion observed, examining the gutted equipment. "Military protocol, not civilian evacuation." "Your people or mine?" Liara asked. "Does it matter anymore?" The question hung between them, unexpectedly profound. After days of survival together, the distinction between human and Syrian seemed increasingly arbitrary, a political division rather than a meaningful difference. Orion moved methodically through the room, checking every console and storage compartment. There might be portable units they missed, emergency beacons or field communicators. Liara joined the search, her height allowing her to reach areas Orion could not. They worked in companionable silence, each focusing on their task with the efficiency of trained operatives. It was Liara who found it, a secure storage locker beneath a console, its locking mechanism still functional. "Here," she called. "This needs an access code." Orion examined the panel, recognition flickering across his features. "This is human military, standard encryption for the period." He entered a sequence from memory and the locker hissed open, revealing its contents. An emergency communication unit, compact but powerful, designed for deep space transmission. "Will it still work?" Liara asked, watching as he carefully extracted the device. "Power cells would normally be degraded after this long," Orion acknowledged, "but these units were designed to last. If we can find a way to boost the signal..." He trailed off, already absorbed in assessing the communicator's condition. Liara left him to his work, continuing to explore the outpost for anything else of value. The living quarters yielded clean clothing, preserved rations that were still edible, if unappetizing, and medical supplies that would prove useful for treating the various injuries they had accumulated during their journey. When she returned to the communication center, she found Orion had partially disassembled the unit, connecting it to the outpost's dormant power systems in an attempt to recharge its depleted cells. "I've got it interfaced with the backup generator," he explained without looking up. "It's drawing power, but slowly. Might take hours to reach broadcast capacity. Then we have time to rest and recover," Liara decided. "I found quarters that are still habitable. And supplies." Orion nodded, finally looking up from his work. The days of harsh travel had left their mark on him. His face was leaner, weathered by exposure, a new scar forming where a hexapod had caught him with its claws during their second encounter with the pack. Yet his eyes remained clear and focused, his movements as precise as ever. They relocated to the living quarters Liara had identified, a small suite that had once housed the outpost's senior personnel. The environmental systems still functioned at a basic level, providing filtered air and minimal temperature regulation. "Real beds," Orion observed with the first genuine smile Liara had seen from him. Almost worth the 80-kilometer hike. The simple expression of pleasure was strangely disarming. Throughout their ordeal, he had maintained such careful control, such disciplined focus, that this glimpse of ordinary human satisfaction seemed almost intimate. They took turns using the sanitation facilities, which still had limited functionality. The luxury of removing days of accumulated grime and dust was profound, elevating their spirits despite the uncertainty of their situation. Liara emerged from her turn feeling renewed, the simple comfort of cleanliness a reminder of the civilization they had temporarily left behind. Orion had laid out the supplies she had gathered: ration packs, medical kits, clean clothing that approximately fit their different physiologies. He had already changed into a standard mining company uniform, the human-designed garment slightly too short for his frame, but infinitely preferable to the tattered remains of his ceremonial attire. The communication unit needs another 2 hours to reach minimum broadcast strength, he reported as they shared a meal of preserved rations. Even then, the signal will be weak. We'll need to be selective about who we contact and what we say. Assuming anyone is listening for our particular frequency, Liara noted, both our governments might have already declared us casualties of the attack. Or traitors, Orion added grimly. If the separatist factions have gained influence, they could have framed us for the assassination of the diplomats killed during the ceremony. The possibility hung heavily between them. They had been so focused on survival that the political implications of their disappearance had remained secondary. Now, with the prospect of reconnecting to civilization imminent, these considerations came rushing back with renewed urgency. Who can we trust? Liara asked, the question directed as much at herself as at Orion. He considered carefully before responding. Not official channels, too easily monitored, too vulnerable to compromise. We need individuals with enough authority to act, but enough independence to verify our information before taking it up the chain of command. My brother, Liara decided, Talon knows you. If what you've told me is true, he'll recognize the significance of your involvement. And on the human side, Commander Ilara Voss, Orion added, my former superior in special reconnaissance. She operates outside standard military hierarchy, answers directly to the Civilian Oversight Committee. They spent the next hour formulating their message, debating each word and phrase for potential misinterpretation. The final communication was both direct and carefully coded, containing verification sequences that would identify them to their chosen recipients while revealing nothing useful to potential interceptors. As the preparation of the communication unit neared completion, a strange tension settled over them. Their time in the wilderness of Kaidan had created a unique dynamic, a partnership based on mutual survival and growing respect. Reconnecting with their respective civilizations would inevitably alter that dynamic, reintroducing the political complexities they had temporarily escaped. What happens after we send this? Liara asked, giving voice to the uncertainty they both felt. Orion paused in his calibration of the communicator. Best case? Our contacts arrange secure extraction. We present our evidence of the conspiracy, and the peace process continues with better protections in place. And worst case? Our message is intercepted, our location compromised, and the conspirators send a kill team to ensure we never reveal what we know, he replied with characteristic bluntness. Or our own governments disavow us as compromised assets. Liara studied him, noting the calm with which he outlined these potentially fatal scenarios. You've considered the possibility that we might not survive this, yet you still insist on sending the message. Because the alternative is worse, he said simply. Hiding here while both our civilizations potentially descend back into war? I can't accept that, even if the price is my life. The conviction in his voice resonated with Liara's own sense of duty. Despite everything they had discovered about potential betrayal within their governments, neither of them had abandoned their fundamental commitment to peace. Then we proceed, she decided, but we prepare for all contingencies. Orion nodded, returning to the communicator. We'll need a defensible position after transmission. The signal will be detectable, even if the content is encrypted. They spent the remaining time securing the outpost, establishing fallback positions, preparing impromptu weapons from mining equipment, and identifying potential escape routes. The activity was familiar to both of them, their military training finding common expression despite their different backgrounds. When the communication unit finally reached full charge, they gathered in the central control room, the message loaded and ready for transmission. Once we send this, there's no turning back, Orion reminded her, his finger poised above the activation control. Liara placed her hand beside his, their fingers almost touching on the console. I know. Together they pressed the control, sending their carefully crafted message hurtling into space. The unit hummed with effort, its ancient components straining to generate enough power for the deep space transmission. Then, with a final surge of energy, it went silent. Its purpose fulfilled, its power cells drained. Now we wait, Orion said, disconnecting the unit and concealing it in case they needed to relocate quickly. The waiting proved more difficult than either had anticipated. After days of constant movement and immediate survival concerns, the enforced stillness of their vigil was its own kind of stress. They took turns monitoring the outpost perimeter, checking and rechecking their defensive preparations, anything to channel their restless energy. Night fell over Kaidan, bringing with it a rare astronomical event, the perfect alignment of the planet's three moons, bathing the landscape in silvery light that transformed the harsh terrain into something almost beautiful. Liara found Orion on the outpost observation deck, gazing up at the spectral display. Triple conjunction, he explained as she joined him, happens once every 17 years on Kaidan, considered an omen in local folklore, a time when barriers between worlds grow thin. You know the indigenous legends? Liara asked, surprised. A shadow of something like regret crossed his features. Part of our cultural briefing before deployment. Know your enemy's myths, exploit their beliefs if necessary. He shook his head slightly. One of many things I'm not proud of from those days. The admission of moral discomfort was unexpected. Throughout their journey, Orion had presented himself as a pragmatist, someone who accepted the necessities of war without excessive self-recrimination. This glimpse of deeper ethical reflection added another layer to her evolving understanding of her human companion. We all carry burdens from the war, Liara said after a moment. Things we did in the name of victory that seem hollow now. Orion turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. If we survive this, if we somehow manage to salvage the peace process, what happens to us? To this marriage of convenience? The question caught Liara off guard. She had been so focused on immediate survival that the longer-term implications of their formal union had receded into abstraction. I don't know, she admitted. The arrangement was meant to be symbolic, a gesture rather than a true partnership. And now? The simple query contained multitudes. After what they had experienced together, after the trust that had developed through shared survival, could they simply return to their original diplomatic roles? Could they pretend that nothing had changed between the Syrian princess and her supposedly harmless human consort? Before Liara could formulate a response, a distant sound interrupted their conversation. The distinctive whine of approaching aircraft, cutting through the still night air with ominous clarity. They found us, Orion said, instantly alert. Too fast for a normal response to our transmission. Someone was already looking. They moved with practiced coordination, abandoning the observation deck for the more defensible interior of the outpost. Through the facility's monitoring systems, they tracked the approaching vessels, 3 combat shuttles, moving in tactical formation toward the mining facility. Design configuration is mixed, Liara noted, studying the grainy images. Human engines, Syrian weapon mounts, mercenaries. Separatists, Orion confirmed grimly. The same coalition that attacked the ceremony. They must have been searching the Badlands since the crash. They had prepared for this possibility, yet the reality of imminent assault still sent adrenaline coursing through their systems. Liara felt the familiar combat focus descending, her senses sharpening as her body prepared for battle. 14 figures deploying from the shuttles, she reported, watching the thermal signatures bloom on the outpost's ancient sensors. Heavy weapons, tactical approach. They're not taking chances this time. Orion checked his makeshift blade, testing its edge one final time. They'll expect us to be in the communications center or the main control room. We use that assumption against them. Their plan was simple but effective, allowing the assault team to penetrate deep into the facility before engaging from unexpected angles. They had prepared ambush points throughout the outpost, using their intimate knowledge of the layout to maximum advantage. As the attackers breached the main entrance, Liara and Orion retreated to their initial positions, communicating through hand signals and the silent understanding that had developed between them. The familiar rhythm of combat preparation, the controlled breathing, the heightened awareness, the mental rehearsal of tactics, created a strange sense of calm despite the dire circumstances. The first team of separatists moved cautiously through the lower levels, their weapons trained on shadows. 4 operatives moving in standard sweep formation, 2 humans, 2 Syrians, their armor bearing no official insignia, but equipped with military-grade technology. From her concealed position in the ventilation system above, Liara watched their progress, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When the team passed directly beneath her position, she gave the signal, a subtle tap on the metal duct that would be inaudible to anyone not specifically listening for it. On the opposite side of the corridor, Orion emerged from a maintenance alcove, his blade catching the emergency lighting in a brief flash of reflected red. The Separatist team reacted immediately, turning toward the perceived threat, exactly as planned. In that moment of distraction, Liara dropped from her position, landing directly among them. Her superior Syrian strength allowed her to neutralize the nearest operative with a single precise blow to the neural cluster at the base of the skull. Simultaneously, Orion engaged the remaining team members, his blade moving with the fluid precision she had witnessed during the ceremony attack. The skirmish was brief but intense. Despite their preparedness, one of the Separatists managed to trigger an alert before falling, warning the remaining assault teams of the ambush. "They'll converge on this position," Orion said, already in motion toward their secondary fallback point. "We need to keep moving, keep them off balance." For the next hour, they engaged in a deadly game of cat and mouse throughout the facility, using their knowledge of the layout to separate the assault teams and eliminate them in smaller groups. The Separatists were well trained, but they lacked the desperation and improvisational tactics that Liara and Orion had developed during their days of survival in the Badlands. Yet numbers and superior weaponry began to tell. A glancing shot from a pulse rifle caught Liara across the shoulder, searing through her borrowed uniform to the blue skin beneath. Orion suffered a knife wound to his thigh when they were temporarily cornered in the processing center, forcing them to fight their way out with increasing desperation. By the time they reached the upper levels, their situation had grown dire. Of the original 14 attackers, 8 remained, still overwhelming odds despite their successes. Worse, their own injuries were accumulating, adrenaline no longer sufficient to mask the pain and limitation of movement. "The roof. Access," Orion gasped, pressing a hand to his bleeding thigh as they took momentary shelter in a storage room. "If we can reach it, we might be able to commandeer one of their shuttles." Liara nodded, her breath coming in sharp bursts as she tried to manage the burning pain in her shoulder. "They'll expect that. They'll have left guards." "No choice," he replied grimly. "We're running out of alternatives and stamina." The admission of vulnerability, coming from someone who had shown such remarkable resilience, underscored the gravity of their situation. They were approaching their physical limits, while the remaining Separatists were still coordinating with cold efficiency. As they prepared to make their desperate push toward the roof access, a new sound penetrated the facility. The distinctive thrum of heavy engines, different from the assault shuttles that had brought the Separatist team. "That's a cruiser-class vessel," Liara identified, her military training immediately recognizing the sound signature. "Military grade." Orion moved to a monitoring console, activating the external cameras with a surge of renewed hope. The screen flickered to life, revealing a sight that momentarily stunned them both. A joint task force vessel hovering above the outpost, its hull bearing the insignia of both human and Syrian military commands. "They received our message," he breathed, disbelief and relief mingling in his voice. "They actually sent a legitimate response force." Through the outpost systems, they heard the unmistakable sound of shipboard weapons powering up, followed by a transmitted ultimatum to the Separatist forces. "Attention, unauthorized personnel. This is Joint Command Vessel Concordia. Surrender immediately or face orbital precision strike." The effect on the Separatist team was immediate. Their coordinated assault pattern dissolved into confusion, then retreat, as they recognized the overwhelming force arrayed against them. Within minutes, the outpost sensors showed the assault shuttles powering up for emergency departure, only to be disabled by precision fire from the Concordia's weapon systems. In the sudden silence that followed, Liara and Orion found themselves looking at each other with a mixture of exhaustion and wonder. Against all odds, their gamble had paid off. The communication had reached trusted allies who had responded with unexpected swiftness and coordination. "We should identify ourselves before they decide we're hostile too," Orion suggested, wincing as he put weight on his injured leg. Together, they made their way to the outpost communication array, now able to utilize the facility's systems fully without fear of attracting unwanted attention. Liara established a direct channel to the Concordia, identifying herself with Imperial authentication codes. The response was immediate, the voice on the other end familiar enough to bring unexpected moisture to her eyes. "This is Prince Talon Tars aboard Joint Command. Vessel Concordia. Liara, is that really you?" "It's me, brother," she confirmed, emotion threatening to overwhelm her usual composure. "I'm with Captain Vale. We're both injured, but alive." "Hold position," Talon instructed, relief evident even through the formal military communication. "We're sending a medical team and security detail. The area is secure. We've captured the majority of the separatist force." As they waited for extraction, Liara found herself studying Orion with new eyes. He sat beside her at the communication console, applying pressure to his wounded leg, his face drawn with pain yet still alert. In the harsh emergency lighting, he looked simultaneously vulnerable and indomitable, a contradiction she was only beginning to understand. "You were right about my brother," she acknowledged. "About everything." Orion's mouth quirked in a tired approximation of a smile. "Not everything. I never anticipated hexapods or acid storms. Or that we might actually begin to understand each other," Liara added quietly. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes that revealed more than words could express. "That was the one hope I couldn't allow myself to voice," he admitted, "that this arrangement might become something real." Before she could respond, the sound of the extraction team reached them. Boots on metal, organized movement rather than the furtive approach of enemies. The moment of private connection was broken, reality reasserting itself as the door to the communications center slid open. Prince Talon entered first, his imperial armor gleaming in the dim light. His blue features so similar to Liara's own, yet marked by different experiences. Different choices? Behind him came Commander Ilara Voss, her human military uniform bearing the distinctive insignia of Special Reconnaissance Division. The reunion was a blur of medical attention, security protocols, and urgent debriefing. Liara found herself separated from Orion as they were treated for their respective injuries, then brought aboard the Concordia for more comprehensive care. The familiar routines of military efficiency surrounded them once more, a stark contrast to the intimate dependency they had developed during their days in the wilderness. Hours later, formally cleaned and treated, wearing the appropriate uniforms of their respective services, Liara and Orion stood together on the Concordia's observation deck. Before them, through the vast viewport, Kaidan's surface rolled away beneath them. The Badlands where they had fought for survival now reduced to abstract patterns of shadow and light. "The conspiracy went deeper than we imagined," Talon explained, standing beside them with Commander Voss. "Elements within both military hierarchies, working with corporate interests that profit from continued conflict. Your marriage ceremony was targeted specifically because it represented a genuine path to lasting peace." "And now?" Liara asked, conscious of Oren's steady presence beside her. "Now we have proof," Commander Voss answered, her weathered human face serious but hopeful. "Your survival, your testimony, the captured separatists, it's enough to purge the worst elements from both command structures. The peace process will continue," Talon confirmed. "Stronger for having been tested. The public on both worlds is already celebrating your survival as a symbol of resilience and cooperation." The political machinery was already in motion, Liara realized, spinning their ordeal into a narrative that served the greater goal of peace. Their personal experience, their private journey from mutual suspicion to profound connection, would be subsumed into the larger story of interspecies reconciliation. As the briefing concluded and Talon and Commander Voss departed to oversee the ongoing security operations, Liara found herself alone with Orion for the first time since their rescue. Standing before the viewport, the vastness of space stretching before them, they seemed simultaneously closer and more distant than they had been in the intimate confines of survival. "They've already decided to use us as symbols again," she observed, watching Kaidan's moons begin their nightly dance across the horizon. The triumphant return of the diplomatic couple, overcoming adversity together. "It's an effective narrative," Orion acknowledged, standing beside her with military precision, so different from the adaptable survivor she had come to know in the Badlands. "One that serves the greater goal." Liara turned to face him directly, studying the face that had become so familiar during their ordeal. The harsh lines remained, the watchful eyes, the subtle scar at his temple, but she now saw beyond these features to the complex individual beneath. "And what about us?" she asked, the question hanging between them with all its unspoken implications. Is that all we are now? Symbols in service to politics? Orion was silent for a long moment, his gaze returning to the planet below, the place where pretense had been stripped away by necessity, where they had discovered truth in the midst of survival. I think, he said finally, turning to meet her eyes directly, that depends entirely on what we choose. And what do you choose, Captain Vale? In answer, he did something unprecedented. He reached out, closing the formal distance between them to take her hand in his. The gesture was simple yet profound, a bridge across the artificial gap that protocol had reinstated between them. I choose to honor the vows we made, he said quietly, not the diplomatic words for public consumption, but the truths we discovered in the Badlands. I choose to believe that understanding between our peoples is possible because I've experienced it firsthand. Lyra found herself responding to his touch, her blue fingers intertwining with his human ones in a visible representation of the connection they had forged. Even if it means continuing to navigate the political currents that nearly killed us both? Especially then, he replied with unexpected intensity. Who better to forge a lasting peace than those who have seen the cost of its absence? Who better to bridge two worlds than those who have already crossed the divide between them? His words resonated with her own unspoken thoughts, the realization that had been growing since their rescue. Their arranged marriage, begun as political theater, had transformed into something with genuine potential, not just for themselves, but for the future they both served. Then perhaps, Liara suggested, a new certainty forming within her, we should inform our respective governments that we intend to honor our marriage in full, not just as a symbol, but as a true alliance between equals. The smile that transformed Orion's face was unlike any expression she had yet seen from him. Unguarded, genuine, touched with both surprise and profound hope. In that moment, she saw the man beneath the soldier, the individual who had emerged during their shared ordeal. I believe, he said, his voice carrying the weight of newfound conviction, that would be a diplomatic development worth pursuing, Princess.